Step into the London of the past, a city wrapped in fog, cobblestones slick with rain, and streets alive with the clatter of horse-drawn carts and the cries of market vendors. Before breakfast became a hurried ritual of tea and toast, mornings in London were a stage for a remarkable variety of foods, each carrying its own story, culture, and social meaning. Some were humble and practical, meant to fuel long hours in factories or along the Thames. Others were elaborate and indulgent, a testament to wealth, global reach, and the influence of empire. Today, many of these meals are all but forgotten, lost to time, yet they tell us more about the city and its people than any history book could. Consider kedgeree, a fragrant mix of rice, smoked fish, and eggs, spiced with curry powder, which once filled the breakfast tables of the Victorian upper class. Imported flavors met British tradition, creating a dish that spoke of empire, travel, and worldly tastes. In stark contrast, the working class Londoner might start the day with bread smeared in dripping, the rendered fat from Sunday's roast. Simple, filling, and practical. Somewhere in between, smoky kippers steamed beside a pot of strong tea, or a fiery plate of deviled kidneys sat on the table of a gentleman's club, bold enough to wake the senses before the day began. These breakfasts were shaped by necessity, class, and geography. Salted porridge fueled laborers before dawn, while eel pie and ale were consumed by Thameside watermen needing sustenance for grueling mornings. Leftovers transformed into bubble and squeak, a dish born of thrift and ingenuity, while toasted cheese offered warmth and comfort in modest homes. Every bite tells a story of resilience, creativity, and adaptation, lessons in how Londoners made the most of what they had, whether in the smoke-filled streets of industrial London or the refined drawing rooms of the affluent. Yet these meals are more than just sustenance, they are a mirror of society. They reveal the contrasts of the city, wealth and poverty, tradition and innovation, simplicity and indulgence. They reflect a time when a single breakfast could signify identity, class, and culture. For the people of London, breakfast was never just a meal. It was the first act of the day, a moment that set the tone for work, conversation, and family life. In this journey, we'll explore the breakfasts Londoners once loved, depended upon, and eventually abandoned. These are the dishes that shaped mornings, carried history, and defined generations. Some will surprise you, others may seem strange, and a few might even shock modern sensibilities. But all of them offer a taste of a London long gone, a city that woke to flavors and rituals far richer and more complex than the simple routines we know today. By uncovering these breakfasts, we aren't just looking at food, we are looking at life itself. The hopes, habits, and challenges of Londoners across centuries. From the smoky elegance of kedgeree to the practical simplicity of salted porridge, each dish invites us to pause, imagine, and remember a city that started every day with flavor, culture, and purpose. 1. Kedgeree, the colonial morning mix. Look back to a London morning in the late 1800s. The streets are still damp from the night rain, the milkman's cart rattles down cobblestones, and inside the homes of the well-to-do, servants are setting out something unusual for breakfast. It's not bacon, not porridge, but a warm golden mound of rice, flakes of smoked fish, and soft-boiled eggs, all perfumed with butter and curry powder. This was kedgeree, a dish born from empire and a taste of Britain's colonial reach before most people had even left their parishes. Kedgeree came to London from India. It was inspired by a dish called khichdi, a simple mix of lentils and rice that British officers encountered during their postings with the East India Company. When they returned home, they brought the idea with them, but changed it entirely. Out went the lentils. In came smoked haddock, cream, parsley, and eggs. The result was a hybrid, British comfort food with Indian roots. By the mid-Victorian era, it had become a breakfast staple in upper-class London households, appearing on sideboards beside silver teapots and toast racks. For Victorians, kedgeree wasn't just about taste, it was about identity. The dish carried with it the aroma of adventure, the prestige of empire, and a subtle reminder that Britain's influence stretched across the globe. To serve kedgeree at breakfast said something that you were worldly, connected, and able to afford imported spices and smoked fish. In a city obsessed with social climbing, even breakfast was a statement piece. But as the 20th century rolled in, that connection faded. Empire was no longer something to celebrate, and life in London changed. The leisurely breakfasts of the upper class gave way to quick cups of tea and toast. The working class never had time for such elaborate dishes in the first place, and so slowly kedgeree disappeared from dining tables, left behind like the faded prints of colonial maps. There's something haunting about that loss. Kedgeree wasn't just food, it was a symbol of an era when mornings carried ceremony and meaning. It told a story about how the British borrowed, adapted, and sometimes misunderstood the foods of the lands they ruled. Today, you might still find it on a few traditional hotel menus, tucked quietly between pancakes and eggs Benedict. But for most Londoners, it's a taste they've never known. Still, if you close your eyes and imagine the smell of smoked haddock and butter drifting through a quiet Victorian kitchen, you can almost hear the faint echo of the past, the sound of spoons on china, and a world just waking up to the flavors of somewhere far away. Next, we move from London's drawing rooms to the colder corners of its kitchens, where the day began not with exotic spices, but with leftovers. 2. Cold roast beef and pickles, the leftover tradition. Picture a foggy London morning in the mid-1800s. Coal smoke drifts through narrow streets, and inside a modest townhouse, breakfast is being laid out, not with sizzling bacon or fresh eggs, but with yesterday's dinner, sliced thin and served cold. On a heavy china plate sits roast beef, chilled overnight, glistening with fat, and beside it, a small dish of sharp pickles. To modern eyes, it looks more like lunch. But to Londoners of the Victorian age, this was breakfast. Cold roast beef wasn't just a meal, it was a habit shaped by practicality. In a city without refrigeration, food had to be eaten quickly, and nothing went to waste. When families roasted a joint of beef for Sunday dinner, the leftovers were too valuable to discard. By morning, they'd be repurposed into a simple, hearty breakfast, served cold with pickles or mustard to cut through the richness. It was the original meal prep, long before the phrase existed. For the middle and working classes alike, it made sense. London life was fast, gritty, and demanding. The city ran on efficiency, and so did its kitchens. Cold meat breakfasts saved time and money, no need to light the stove or fry anything. A few slices of bread, a cup of strong tea, and you were ready for another day in the bustling heart of the empire. Even in grander homes, cold meats often appeared on the breakfast sideboard, arranged next to cold game pies and buttered rolls, as a sign of plenty. But this tradition carried more than thrift. It carried nostalgia. For many Londoners, the taste of cold roast beef evoked home and stability in a changing world. It was a dish that connected generations, reminding them of simpler times before the city grew too large, too loud, and too modern. When industrialization swept through London, bringing canned goods and imported foods, the humble cold breakfast began to seem old-fashioned, something your grandmother might still eat, but no one admitted to enjoying anymore. By the mid-20th century, cold roast beef had all but vanished from breakfast tables, replaced by hot fry-ups and cereals that promised convenience in shiny packaging. What was once seen as practical and respectable became a relic of the past. Yet, there's something comforting in its simplicity: meat, pickles, bread, and tea. It was a breakfast built on honesty, born from a time when waste was a sin and flavor came second to necessity. Today, few Londoners would start their morning this way. But if you ever find yourself standing in a quiet kitchen with last night's roast sitting cold on the counter, slice it thin, add a pickle, and take a bite. For just a moment, you'll taste a London that no longer exists, one that made the most of what it had and found satisfaction in the scraps. Up next, breakfast takes a fiery turn, served hot, spicy, and unmistakably bold. 3. Deviled kidneys, the fiery breakfast dish London, early 1900s. The sun hasn't yet burned through the fog, and the streets hum with the sound of carriage wheels and vendors shouting their wares. Inside a gentleman's club off Pall Mall, a waiter in a starched apron carries out a silver platter, steam rising, the air thick with the scent of mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and something faintly metallic. On the plate, deviled kidneys, glistening in a dark, spicy gravy. It's 7 in the morning, and the city's elite are starting their day with heat and heart. Deviled kidneys were once the breakfast of men who believed in stamina, politicians, bankers, and journalists who gathered before work to eat, drink, and debate. The deviling referred to the fiery mix of spices and sauces used to flavor the kidneys, usually lamb or veal, giving them a punch that woke the senses faster than any coffee. Recipes varied, but most included mustard powder, cayenne pepper, butter, and a generous splash of sherry or Worcestershire sauce. Served on toast, they were rich, hot, and unapologetically bold. The dish reflected the spirit of the Edwardian age, confident, indulgent, and proud of its traditions. To eat deviled kidneys was to eat like an Englishman of means, decisive, adventurous, perhaps even a little reckless. The flavors were not for the timid, and neither were the men who loved them. London newspapers of the time often described the dish as bracing or invigorating, a breakfast for those who faced the day with ambition and appetite. But there was another side to it, too. For many, deviled kidneys symbolized a social divide. While the working poor might start their day with bread and tea, the wealthy sat in polished dining rooms feasting on organ meats dressed in imported sauces. Even then, people understood the irony, luxury born from the cheapest cuts of meat. In a way, deviled kidneys were both humble and grand, a contradiction perfectly suited to London itself. By the mid-20th century, though, the dish began to fade. Changing tastes, stricter hygiene standards, and a growing squeamishness toward organ meats pushed it to the edge of memory. The fiery breakfasts of the Edwardians gave way to milder fare, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast. Deviled kidneys lingered in old cookbooks and the menus of traditional hotels where they were ordered more out of curiosity than hunger. Still, there's something thrilling about the idea of them. Imagine a cold morning, a hot plate, the sharp bite of mustard on your tongue. It's not just food with flavor, a taste of a London that was louder, braver, and unafraid of a little fire at breakfast. From the smoky dining rooms of Edwardian gentlemen to the humbler kitchens of ordinary families, the city's next breakfast story was born not from luxury, but from leftovers and ingenuity. 4. Bubble and squeak. Born from Sunday's scraps fry. It's Monday morning in post-war London. The streets are gray, the ration books are thin, and the kitchens are colder than the air outside. But in a small terraced house, a frying pan sizzles quietly on the stove. Inside, bits of leftover cabbage and potatoes from yesterday's roast dinner are being mashed together, pressed flat, and fried until golden and crisp. The dish crackles as it cooks, bubble and squeak, named for the sounds it makes in the pan. Few dishes capture London's spirit like this one. Born from thrift and necessity, bubble and squeak became the city's unofficial breakfast of survival. It didn't belong to the wealthy clubs or the country estates. It belonged to the people, housewives, laborers, and anyone trying to stretch a Sunday roast into Monday's breakfast relied on it. It was simple. Mix your leftovers, fry them up, and make something out of nothing. The ingredients varied depending on what was left from the roast, sometimes a bit of beef or carrot, sometimes just potatoes and greens. The real magic came from the frying. The outside crisped to perfection, while the inside stayed soft and comforting. It was hearty, filling, and familiar. In homes where every scrap mattered, bubble and squeak wasn't just food. It was a small act of resilience. The dish first appeared in writing in the late 1700s, but it truly became iconic during the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially through wartime. When food was rationed and waste was unthinkable, bubble and squeak was the kind of ingenuity that kept families going. It turned scarcity into flavor and made breakfast feel like a small victory. Even the name carried cheer, a bit of humor in hard times. Over time, it became more than a meal. It was comfort food before anyone called it that, a link between generations. Older Londoners remembered the sound of it frying on cold mornings, the smell of crisped cabbage filling the kitchen, the satisfaction of knowing nothing was wasted. In a city where life was often unpredictable, bubble and squeak represented steadiness. But as convenience foods and supermarkets took over, the tradition began to fade. Instant cereals replaced leftovers, and breakfast lost its sound, the bubble and the squeak that once filled the air. Today, it survives mostly in pubs and Sunday brunch menus, reimagined as a classic British side. But the real thing, the humble Monday morning version, belongs to a different London, one where flavor was born from frugality. Still, if you ever fry up yesterday's potatoes and greens, listen closely. That soft, bubbling sound is history whispering back. A reminder of a time when London's kitchens ran on creativity, and a simple pan of scraps could make the whole house feel warm again. And speaking of warmth, the next breakfast was one of London's simplest pleasures, spread on toast, gleaming like gold, and loved by those who could afford little else. Next section, bread and dripping, the breakfast of the working poor. 5. Bread and dripping, the breakfast of the working poor. Imagine dawn breaking over London's East End in the late 19th century. The factories are already rumbling to life, the air thick with smoke and soot. In narrow brick terraces, families rise early. There's little time and even less money, but breakfast still matters. On a chipped plate sits a thick slice of bread, spread not with butter or jam, but with something humbler, beef dripping. Bread and dripping was the breakfast of the working poor, a meal born out of necessity and resourcefulness. After roasting a joint of meat, usually on a rare Sunday when there was money for it, families would save the fat that melted off. Once cooled, it's solidified into a pale, savory spread. The top layer was creamy white, while the bottom, called the jelly, was rich and flavorful. Spread onto bread with a little salt and pepper, it was filling, tasty, and cost nothing extra. It might sound unappetizing today, but for millions of Londoners, it was a small comfort in hard times. A few mouthfuls of dripping meant the difference between going to work with an empty stomach and having enough energy to last through the day. In households where butter was a luxury, dripping was the substitute, sometimes the only one children ever knew. There was a quiet dignity to it, too. Bread and dripping wasn't fancy, but it was honest. It reflected a London that lived close to hunger yet refused to give in. Even the name, plain practical, matched the people who ate it. You didn't need cutlery, just your hands and a bit of warmth from the hearth. For a moment, it felt like plenty, but not everyone looked on it kindly. As the 20th century arrived and food advertising began to shape public taste, dripping came to be seen as poor man's fare, unrefined, old-fashioned, and unhealthy. Margarine and butter pushed it aside, while post-war prosperity promised brighter, cleaner breakfasts. By the 1960s, few Londoners would admit to eating bread and dripping anymore. It belonged to a past many wanted to forget, a past of shortages and soot. And yet, ask an older Londoner about it, and you'll often see a smile. They'll remember the smell of a Sunday roast filling the house, the jar of dripping cooling on the windowsill, and the simple pleasure of scraping it onto bread before heading out into the cold. It was more than food, it was survival with flavor. Today, bread and dripping occasionally makes a nostalgic comeback in gastropubs and food history events where chefs call it beef fat toast and serve it with herbs or sea salt. But no matter how it's dressed up, it can't quite capture the spirit of the original, a working class breakfast that kept London going, one humble slice at a time. From the kitchens of the poor to the breakfast bowls of the respectable, London's next morning ritual is built around something plain, hot, and surprisingly polarizing. 6. Porridge with salt, not sugar. It's a gray London morning in the 1850s. A pot simmers quietly over the fire, steam rising in steady wisps. Inside, oats bubble and thicken into something simple but essential: porridge. There's no honey, no fruit, no sugar in sight, just a pinch of salt and a wooden spoon. For most London families, this wasn't just breakfast, it was fuel for survival. Before the age of sweet cereals and flavored oats, porridge was a serious affair. It was plain, hearty, and filling, everything a working man or woman needed before a long day of labor. Oats were cheap, easy to store, and could be stretched to feed large families. Adding sugar was a luxury many couldn't afford, so salt became the seasoning of choice. It brought out the grain's natural flavor, and in a city where food was often bland or boiled to death, that small touch of salt felt like a kind of comfort. Londoners had borrowed the habit from the Scots, who had long eaten salted porridge for breakfast. But by the time it reached England, it had become a symbol of modest living, something eaten by factory workers, servants, and anyone counting pennies. The wealthy might start their day with kippers or kidneys, but for the rest, it was a bowl of oats and a few grains of salt before heading into the fog. It was more than nourishment, though. Porridge was ritual. It required patience. The slow stirring over a coal fire, the careful ladling into bowls, the way families gathered around to eat in silence before the day began, it all gave meaning to the simplest meal. And for many Londoners, the warmth of that bowl was often the only warmth they'd feel until nightfall. Still, there was a kind of pride in it. Eating porridge meant you were practical, disciplined, and self-sufficient. It was honest food for honest work. Children might have grumbled at the lack of sweetness, but it built the habit of resilience, something Londoners would need through decades of hardship, from the Industrial Revolution to the Blitz. As sugar became cheaper in the late 19th century, the custom began to shift. Housewives added treacle or golden syrup, and later shop-bought porridge oats came with instructions suggesting milk, cream, and fruit. What was once plain sustenance became breakfast comfort. By the mid-20th century, salted porridge had almost disappeared, remembered mostly by older generations who still swore that the sweet stuff ruined it. Today, the idea of putting salt in porridge might seem odd, even unthinkable. But for centuries, that pinch of salt was the taste of London's working morning, humble, unadorned, and deeply human. It was a breakfast that didn't ask for pleasure, only purpose. And yet, not all London mornings were so quiet or plain. Some began with the sizzle of meat, the smell of frying bread, and the promise of something heartier than oats ever could be. 7. The London Fry-Up, Victorian Edition. Step into a bustling Victorian kitchen in London around 1880. The morning light filters through soot-streaked windows and the air is thick with the aroma of sizzling fat. On a heavy iron skillet, mutton chops hiss alongside strips of fried bread, while small pans bubble with stewed tomatoes. This was the London fry-up, long before the term full English became commonplace. A breakfast designed to fuel hard work and sustain long, cold days. The Victorian fry-up was a far heartier, meat-centered affair than the modern version. Unlike today's neatly arranged plates of eggs, bacon, and beans, these breakfasts could include mutton, beef, sausages, and even leftover game from Sunday dinners. Fried bread absorbed every bit of fat and flavor, and the occasional fried onion or tomato brought balance to the richness. It was less about presentation and more about survival. A hot, calorific start to the day for families living in industrial London. This breakfast mattered because London was a city on the move. Factory workers, port laborers, and servants needed sustenance to endure long hours in demanding jobs. The fry-up was practical, versatile, and endlessly adaptable to whatever ingredients were on hand. It reflected both the resourcefulness of working-class households and the culinary influence of middle-class kitchens, where eggs and mutton were more readily available. Yet there was a cultural layer to it as well. Eating a fry-up was a ritual, a shared experience that brought families together before the workday scattered them across the city. In larger households, the smells of frying meat and bread signaled order, warmth, and security. For the children, it was comfort. For the adults, it was nourishment and pride. But the fry-up also had its darker side. It was greasy, heavy, and by today's standards, a nutritional overkill. Victorian doctors occasionally warned of its richness, and yet its popularity never waned. It was a reflection of a city in transition, gritty, ambitious, and unapologetically robust. By the early 20th century, some elements, like mutton chops, began to decline as bacon and eggs took center stage, but the essence of the fry-up lived on, influencing British breakfasts for decades to come. Today, the modern fry-up is often served as a weekend indulgence, with eggs, bacon, and sausages replacing the diverse meats of Victorian kitchens. But imagining the Victorian version gives a glimpse into London life where breakfast was a hardy armor against hardship, a plate full of energy, resilience, and ritual. From sizzling pans, we now turn to a breakfast with a far more pungent aroma, a dish that might make even the hardiest visitor pause, yet was once celebrated across the city. 8. Kippers and tea. The smoked fish morning. Picture a quiet London morning in the early 1900s. Fog hangs low over the Thames, and the city slowly awakens to the clatter of carts and the distant whistle of steam engines. Inside a modest kitchen, a family gathers around a simple breakfast. A pair of golden brown kippers, hot and oily, with a pot of strong black tea on the side. The aroma is unmistakable, smoky, briny, and utterly London. Kippers were a staple of the working class breakfast, especially in coastal and riverside communities. Smoked herring, split open, salted, and hung over wood smoke. They were cheap, nutritious, and could be stored without refrigeration, a crucial advantage before electric fridges became commonplace. Tea, of course, was ubiquitous, providing warmth, comfort, and caffeine to start the day. Together, kippers and tea offered a breakfast that was simple, sustaining, and entirely practical for a city on the move. Yet it wasn't just about nourishment. Kippers carried ritual and identity. For many Londoners, particularly those with roots in fishing towns or working-class neighborhoods, eating smoked fish at breakfast was a connection to home and heritage. The briny taste, sharp and assertive, was an acquired comfort, something generations had learned to love from childhood. London markets overflowed with them, and the rhythmic chopping and preparation became as familiar as the city's chimneys and cobbled streets. But for outsiders, the dish could be shocking. Tourists and newcomers often recoiled at the smell, describing it as pungent, even overpowering. And yet, for those who grew up with it, the kipper was a morning anchor, a sign that another day in the bustling city had begun. In hotels and boarding houses, kippers were often served alongside eggs and toast, a slightly more refined version that tried to cater to both local and visiting tastes. By the mid-20th century, however, kippers began to decline as breakfast habits changed. Convenience foods, cereals, and milder flavors displaced the smoky fish in urban kitchens. Today, a kipper breakfast is mostly a weekend treat or a specialty hotel offering, a nostalgic echo of a London that once prized flavor over subtlety. Yet there's something enduring in the image of a steaming plate of kippers, a cup of strong tea, and a morning spent by the window watching the fog lift over the city. It's a reminder that breakfast, in all its forms, reflects culture, history, and the practical realities of daily life. From the smoky fish of riverside kitchens, we move to the comfort of cheese on toast, a humble dish that predates its modern name but delighted Londoners for generations. 9. Toasted cheese, a breakfast before it became lunch. Step into a London morning in the 19th century. The aroma of freshly baked bread drifts through a modest home, and on the hearth, slices are being toasted until golden. Then comes the cheese, rich, creamy, melted over the warm bread. This was the precursor to what many now know as Welsh rarebit, a humble breakfast that delighted Londoners long before it ever became associated with afternoon tea or lunch. Toasted cheese was surprisingly versatile. Some households added a splash of ale or a hint of mustard to elevate the flavor, while others simply relied on the quality of the cheese itself. Cheddar was most common, and the combination of crisp bread with molten cheese made a satisfying meal that required minimal preparation. In an era when many breakfasts were rushed or frugal, toasted cheese offered warmth, flavor, and a sense of indulgence. The dish's popularity lay in its accessibility. Bread and cheese were staples in almost every London household, and a quick toast with melted cheese turned them into something special. It was filling enough to see a worker through a morning of labor, yet simple enough to prepare before the city's streets became crowded with carts, horses, and pedestrians. For middle-class families, it could even be served alongside a poached egg or a cup of tea for a more refined start. Yet there was something charmingly unpretentious about toasted cheese. It wasn't a dish of imported spices or smoked fish. It was honest, reliable, and comforting. Its simplicity allowed it to become a beloved part of everyday life, even as other breakfast trends came and went. Many Londoners remembered it as a childhood staple, a warm bite that made mornings easier and kitchens smell of home. Over time, the dish migrated from breakfast to lunch, eventually acquiring the name Welsh rarebit and a slightly fancier reputation. By the mid-20th century, few Londoners thought of cheese on toast as a morning meal, yet the practice had shaped breakfast culture for generations. It was a bridge between simplicity and comfort, a dish that reminded families of warmth, sustenance, and small pleasures. 10. Eel pie and ale for breakfast. Picture the bustling Thameside markets of 18th and 19th century London. Dawn breaks over the river, and the smell of smoke, fish, and bread fills the air. Among the laborers and watermen, breakfast was unlike the gentle teas and kippers of wealthier homes. Here, a hot, flaky eel pie, sometimes accompanied by a small mug of ale, was the start of the day, hearty enough to fuel a life spent hauling nets and pulling barges. Eel pies were a specialty of London's working-class river communities. The Thames teemed with eels, and enterprising cooks turned them into pies with rich, savory fillings encased in pastry. Served warm, these pies provided protein and energy for men who needed sustenance before a long day of labor. The ale wasn't just for taste, it was a practical choice. Weak beer or ale was safer to drink than water, often fortified with extra calories and warmth for early mornings. This breakfast mattered because it was built for survival. For laborers living along the riverbanks, the day began long before sunrise, and a filling meal could mean the difference between strength and exhaustion. Eating eel pie for breakfast wasn't indulgence, it was necessity, a ritual rooted in the rhythms of life along the Thames. It also reflected a culture that valued local resources. The river provided food, and the community turned it into nourishment efficiently and creatively. Yet there was an edge to it. To outsiders, the idea of eating eel pie for breakfast, sometimes washed down with ale, seemed shocking or even unappetizing. But for those who grew up with it, it was comfort, tradition, and pride. The taste of flaky pastry, soft eel, and subtle spices reminded them of home, community, and resilience in a city defined by its hustle. As the 20th century progressed, eel pies gradually faded from breakfast tables. Industrialization, changing tastes, and stricter food regulations made them less common, and the working-class ritual of river breakfasts became a memory. Today, eel pies survive mostly in historic festivals or specialty eateries, a nod to a London that once lived closely with its waterways. But imagine that foggy morning along the Thames, the warmth of a freshly baked pie in one hand, the murmur of the river in the other, and the day ahead demanding strength. For those early Londoners, breakfast wasn't just about taste. It was about endurance, community, and the unspoken bond of sharing life on the water. Next, we move to a refined morning ritual, where delicate flavors and precise preparation mark the breakfast tables of London's middle class. Next section, boiled eggs and anchovy toast. As we close this journey through London's forgotten breakfasts, it becomes clear that these meals were far more than food. They were windows into history, society, and culture. They tell us who Londoners were, what they valued, and how they faced the rhythm of life before the modern conveniences we take for granted. Every dish, from humble bread and dripping to the fiery deviled kidneys or smoky kippers, carries the imprint of a time, a place, and the people who made it. These breakfasts reveal contrasts that define the city. The upper-class luxury of kedgeree next to the practical efficiency of bubble and squeak, the bold flavors of eel pie and ale for laborers versus the refined precision of boiled eggs on anchovy toast for the middle class. They remind us that food was not only sustenance, but also identity, status, and comfort. Each morning meal tells a story of ingenuity, resilience, and sometimes indulgence. Even the simplest porridge, salted rather than sweetened, holds a lesson about frugality and survival in a city where life could be harsh and unforgiving. Many of these breakfasts vanished as London modernized. Industrialization, changing tastes, and the rise of convenience foods pushed the old rituals aside. Foods that were once ordinary and necessary became rare, nostalgic, or even repulsive to new generations. Yet they survive in memory, in historic cookbooks, and in the occasional menu at a traditional hotel or gastropub. They remind us that what is common today may have once been extraordinary, and that even the simplest morning routine carries the weight of history. Beyond sustenance, these breakfasts also reveal the human story. They speak of families huddled around coal fires, of children eating what was available, of laborers drawing strength from whatever the river or kitchen provided. They reflect a London defined by contrasts, wealth and poverty, innovation and tradition, simplicity and extravagance. They show us a city that woke each day with purpose, creativity, and often a small measure of comfort in a challenging world. Today, few Londoners would recognize these breakfasts, yet they offer a lesson in perspective. In our age of instant coffee, cereal, and convenience, it's easy to forget the richness of a morning meal that required time, care, and thought. These dishes are a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring power of food to connect us to culture, community, and memory. So next time you pour your tea or butter your toast, remember the breakfasts that came before. The smoky, spicy, savory, and sometimes shocking morning rituals that fueled a city and shaped its people. In the echo of sizzling pans, the aroma of smoked fish, and the warmth of a humble slice of bread, the breakfasts of old London remain alive, not in daily routine, but in memory, imagination, and history. They remind us that every meal tells a story, and every morning is an opportunity to taste the past. If you want, I can now create the full expanded sections 115, each 400 to 550 words, to follow this introduction and lead naturally into the countdown. This would give you a complete, cohesive script ready for production. Do you want me to do that next?